Hello, we're going to talk about the road to revolution, which means that we're going to talk about the pre-Revolutionary War events that led up to a revolt against Britain. Alright, so let's begin. This happened after the French and Indian War, in case you guys were wondering. The new laws of the land. So after the French and Indian War, the King of England, King George II, decided that he needed to put more taxes on his colonists as well as his own people in Britain. So he created the Sugar Act of 1764, which also titled the American Revenue Act of 1764. This increased taxes on molasses as well as sugar and wine and coffee and anything else that was considered a foreign import, meaning that they got it from different countries, different lands. But this disrupted the colonial economy by reducing what the colonists were able to buy and sell because the taxing was so high. And then the Stamp Act of 1765 was actually the first attempt to actually control the colonies, and the king hoped that it would also solve his debt crisis, as he doubled his debt because of the French and Indian War, which started out as about $72,000 now, or $72 million, and it escalated after the war to about $140 million. And so he was hoping that by taxing his people more, he would be able to pay off that debt quicker. And so he basically taxed any form of paper. So that means you got your journals, you got your paper, the newspaper, anything that would require any form of paper was taxed, and taxed so heavily that many of the colonists began to start to think of a revolution. But the laws continued, and the Declaratory Act of 1766 just made sure that the king expressed his dominion over the colonies, declaring that the colonies had to be obedient to him or there would be consequences. And it also made it so that only the British Parliament would be able to create laws over the colonies, so there was no representation or anything. They weren't able to make their own laws. They weren't able to govern themselves. Everything was taken over by Britain later. And then next was the Townshend Revenue Act, which of 1767, and this raised taxes on glass and paint, oil, and other household items that were needed to build or live in this time period. This raised hostilities even higher between Britain and the colonists, and even British trade started to diminish, and other merchants had to kind of intercede and bring their own goods to keep the economy going. So this led up to the Boston Massacre of 1770, where the colonists were just so fed up in Boston that they started a street fight by throwing snowballs at the British soldiers. However, Captain Thomas of the British Army called in more soldiers and told them to shoot into the crowd. 3 colonists were killed instantly, and 8 more were wounded, resulting in 2 more casualties succumbing to their wounds. So they died in the hospital later. And so the colonists wanted the captain and his troops to be tried for murder, but as the British army was in charge, they felt that they were justified and there was no need for a murder trial, so it did not have one. So shortly after the Tea Act, where the tea itself was just taxed as much as it possibly could, the colonists decided to start fighting back. During the night, the townspeople boarded a ship dressed inappropriately as Native Americans, and they dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. To put that in perspective, that little block there on the corner, that is a block of tea from this time period, and that block would probably serve a family about for a year, just shaving little by little, often heating it up and making their own tea. And that block itself was kind of pricey. By today's standards, it would be about $20 a block. And so, with that many, the damage was equal to $750,000. So they dumped $750,000 worth of tea into the harbor as a form of protest against the British government. So after that, King George decided that he wasn't going to put up with the colonies anymore, and he was going to enforce more acts, which the colonists coined as the Intolerable Acts of 1774. The first one was the Quartering Act, which allowed British soldiers to stay in colonists' home indefinitely. Governors and landlords were able to enforce troops to stay with colonists that they looked over in case that there was any form of disloyalty or anything, because it's kind of hard to plan a revolution when there's the enemy soldier sitting in your living room, and so that caused some issues. And so the next one was the Quebec Act, which satisfied only the French Canadians, and it gave them religious freedom to practice Catholicism. It also restored the French form of civil law, which they were used to and they already were abiding by, and it created less tension. However, it also nullified the extension of the boundaries of the American colonies and receded it to the French Canadians, which means that they took the land away from the American colonies and gave it to the Canadians, which didn't sit too well with the American colonists. So this led to Patrick Henry saying the classic line, "Give me liberty or give me death," saying that he would no longer be a part of British rule, or he would die trying. He did not want to be a part of Britain anymore. He wanted to have his own country where he was able to have a say in what he did, what he bought, what he was able to do with his life. He wanted freedom, he wanted liberty, or he was going to die trying to get it, which was basically the whole set the precedence for the Revolutionary War. So the very first battle that happened occurred in Connecticut, in Lexington, where Minutemen were. So Minutemen, to clarify, are a colonist militia consisting of civilians with old guns called muskets, and they needed to be ready to fight the British within a minute's notice in case so they could basically ambush the redcoats. But in this particular situation, the British were actually on their way to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock in Lexington because of treason against the crown. As they were going through Lexington to grab them, and they were also going to Concord to seize the gunpowder that the colonists had. However, the spies within the British Army were able to tell the Minutemen what was happening, and were able to ambush the British soldiers by placing 2 lanterns into a church steeple, which meant that they were coming by sea. If they were coming by land, they would only light 1 lantern. However, this particular instance of battles was also called the shot heard around the world, because at this time Britain had a lot of colonies, had a lot of colonies, and were had a lot of land to rule over that maybe the people didn't want, and so that started giving them the ideas to start their own revolutions and kind of build up tension against the British Army and give them hope. And so this led to the first commander-in-chief, George Washington, in 1775. He had shown his worth in the French and Indian War, as he was a major in the British Army, and was later appointed to an ambassador for the British Crown. And after showing such great leadership, and he had a determined sense of duty for his home, he was appointed to the commander-in-chief, basically the head of the Continental Army, by the Second Continental Congress. And from there, we can actually start on the revolution, and the Revolutionary War begins.